Janine, step away from the claims terminal and leave the screen open.
I'm just reviewing flagged claims.
Janine Rayford operated inside Michigan's unemployment fraud prevention system for years with almost no oversight. More than 2,800 fraudulent claims passed through her hands. Not one person checked.
Those flags were closed without proper review.
That happens when the system backs up?
The state badge that had granted her access to the Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency for 13 years was already being processed for revocation. By the time federal agents from 3 separate agencies finished compiling their case, the numbers told the story she could not. $50,000 in bribes. $2.86 million in fraudulent unemployment benefits routed to third-party claimants. A mandatory minimum federal sentence stacked on top of a 5-year exposure. The fraud prevention triggers she was paid to dismiss had documented every single closure with her login. Quick poll before we go any further. How many of you would have caught the warning signs in a case like this if it was happening at your own job, in your own department, with your own colleague? Be honest in the comments, and subscribe if this is your first time here. We cover accountability cases like this one every single week, and the people involved are rarely the ones you would expect. Janine Yvette Rayford was born in the fall of 1985 in Detroit, Michigan, the second of 3 daughters in a working-class household. Her mother, Patrice Rayford, worked as a unit secretary at Sinai Grace Hospital, handling the daily flow of shift change paperwork, patient admissions, and discharge folders. Her father, Marcus Rayford, drove a route for a commercial linen supply company that served restaurants, salons, and medical offices across Wayne County. The family lived in a 2-story brick on the west side, near the corner of Grand River and Greenfield, in a neighborhood that still held onto a careful, deliberate pride. Childhood for Janine was structured. Her mother kept a wall calendar in the kitchen that mapped every appointment, every school event, every birthday, every payment due date for every utility. By the time Janine was 10, she had a chore list with check boxes. By 12, she was the one keeping the calendar updated. Her teachers at Mumford High wrote notes home calling her responsible beyond her years, and, in one report from a 10th grade civics teacher, the kind of student who actually reads the syllabus and then asks for the supplemental reading. In 2003, she enrolled at Henry Ford College in Dearborn for an associate's degree in business administration. She paid for it with a combination of part-time work at a Coney Island on Schaefer Highway and small federal Pell Grants. She finished the 2-year program in 2 years, on time, and immediately transferred to a 4-year state program for a bachelor's in public administration. She completed the bachelor's in 2007. Her first state job came in 2008, in the middle of the worst Michigan economy in living memory. She started at the Department of Treasury in a clerical role, processing personal income tax returns at a desk on the 3rd floor of the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center downtown. Her annual salary was $31,400. She kept a small framed photo of her parents on her desk and a stained Henry Ford College coffee mug she refused to throw out. In 2010, she married Andre Rayford, a maintenance supervisor for a Detroit Public Schools facilities contractor. They had a quiet wedding at a banquet hall on Schaefer. In 2013, their son Jordan was born. The family rented a duplex in Westland for a year and then bought a 3-bedroom on Beach Daly Road in Redford in the spring of 2014. Janine repainted the dining room herself, eggshell over a builder beige base, 3 coats, on the second weekend after closing. In 2012, Janine transferred from Treasury to the Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency. The position was claims examiner, starting salary $42,800. Her training class lasted 6 weeks at the UIA's processing center near Cadillac Square. Her instructor wrote in her training evaluation that she demonstrated strong familiarity with claims processing software, asked thoughtful questions about exception handling, and was likely to advance into a fraud review track within 2 years. The instructor was right. By 2016, Janine had been promoted to senior claims examiner. By late 2019, she had been promoted again, this time to a fraud review specialist position inside the UIA's Claims Integrity Unit. The role gave her direct authority over a portion of the agency's flagged claim pipeline. The role gave her the seat. The role gave her the access that would, 4 months later, become the most valuable resource in a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. Her performance reviews from that period describe her in language her mother would have framed and hung above the calendar. Thorough, detail-oriented, knows the system inside out, an asset to the team. One supervisor noted in 2018 that Janine was the kind of reviewer who treats every flagged claim like it might be the one that matters. The Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency exists at the intersection of state and federal authority. It administers Michigan's portion of the federal state unemployment insurance system, processing claims from laid-off workers, dispersing weekly benefit payments, and operating a fraud prevention architecture designed to prevent improper payments before they leave the agency's accounts. In a normal year, the UIA processes a few thousand new claims per week. Its staff of roughly 1,500 employees handles intake, eligibility review, fraud detection, appeals, and employer-side audit work. The fraud prevention triggers are automated. They run in the background of every claim. A trigger fires when a claim pattern matches a known fraud profile, an employment history that does not match the wage records reported by the employer, an address tied to multiple prior fraudulent claims, a banking instruction that routes payments to an out-of-state prepaid card, a social security number with a recent identity theft flag. When a trigger fires, the claim is removed from the automated payment queue and routed to a human reviewer. The reviewer's job is to investigate the flag, request additional documentation from the claimant if needed, resolve the inconsistency, or escalate the claim to the agency's Office of Inspector General for fraud investigation. The reviewer can also dismiss the trigger and close the information request if the reviewer determines, in good faith, that the flag was a false positive. The entire architecture depends on a single assumption. The human reviewer is honest. The human reviewer is reading the file. The human reviewer is doing the work. When that assumption holds, the trigger system catches fraud. When that assumption fails, the trigger system becomes a paper-thin formality with the agency's seal on the letterhead. In March of 2020, the assumption was about to be tested at a scale the agency had never imagined. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down Michigan's economy in 3 weeks. The state's unemployment rate exploded from under 4% to over 23%. The UIA went from processing a few thousand new claims per week to processing tens of thousands per day. Federal pandemic programs flooded the system with money. Pandemic unemployment assistance opened benefits to gig workers and self-employed claimants who had never qualified before. Pandemic emergency unemployment compensation extended duration. Federal pandemic unemployment compensation added $600 a week on top of state benefits for a period in 2020. Money was moving through the system at a rate no fraud prevention architecture in the country was built to handle. The triggers kept firing. The claims kept piling up in the human review queue, and the reviewers, working from home on agency laptops, had more discretionary authority than they had ever had before. The December 2023 Auditor General report would later quantify the consequences. $245.1 million in fraudulent payments to ineligible individuals. A separate Deloitte estimate concluded the UIA had cost taxpayers $8.5 billion more than it should have between March of 2020 and September of 2021. Janine Rayford was sitting at one of the seats inside that architecture, and someone was about to offer her a deal. The first conversation took place in the late spring of 2020. A man Janine had known peripherally through a cousin reached out on a Saturday afternoon. He had a question about the unemployment system, he said. Just a general question. They met for coffee at a place on Plymouth Road in Livonia. The dining room was half closed. They sat at a booth by the window. The question was specific. He knew people, he said, who needed claims approved. The system was a mess. Things were sitting in queue for weeks. He had heard from another cousin, who had heard from a friend, that there were people inside the UIA who could help things along. He wanted to know if Janine was one of those people. He wanted to know what it would cost. She did not say no. That was the first decision. The second decision was made 3 days later, when she logged into the agency system from her kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, pulled up the first claim on the list he had sent her, and dismissed the fraud prevention trigger. The trigger had fired on an address mismatch. The claimant's listed residence did not match any of the wage reporting employer records on file. A standard review would have generated an information request to the claimant, asking for proof of residence and employment history. Janine closed the information request. She marked the trigger as a false positive. She approved the claim for benefit disbursement. 2 days later, $6,000 in pandemic unemployment benefits hit a prepaid card in another claimant's name. 3 days after that, an envelope containing $2,000 in cash was left for Janine at a designated drop point her contact had arranged, a corner of a strip mall parking lot off Telegraph Road. The math was simple. The risk felt manageable. The agency was drowning. The pattern scaled. Through the summer of 2020, Janine processed clusters of claims supplied to her by the conspirators. Each claim followed the same architecture: a real or stolen identity, a fabricated employment history, a bank instruction routing payments to a prepaid card or to an account the conspirators controlled. When the trigger fired, the claim came to Janine's queue. She dismissed the trigger. She closed the information request. She moved on. The cash payments arrived in different forms, sometimes envelopes, sometimes wire transfers run through an intermediary, sometimes a stack of bills handed to her in a parking lot on Joy Road. Federal investigators would later trace more than $50,000 in payments directly to Janine across the conduct window, and would identify additional unexplained deposits the indictment described as consistent with the bribery scheme. She did not buy a new house. She did not lease a luxury vehicle. The Beach Daily Road home stayed the same on the outside. The 2017 Chevrolet Equinox in the driveway stayed the same. What changed was smaller. A new kitchen island, a finished basement, a family vacation to Myrtle Beach that summer, new school clothes for Jordan, a monthly habit of paying utility bills in cash rather than online. She knew what a forensic auditor would look for. She had read the agency's training materials on the typical financial footprints of fraud. The agency was not watching her. The agency was watching the volume. The triggers were firing at a rate the unit had never seen. The supervisors were focused on throughput, on backlog reduction, on the political pressure from Lansing to get pandemic benefits flowing. Janine's dismissal rate looked high. So did everyone else's. The whole queue was being cleared at speeds no one had time or authority to question. By the early fall of 2020, the volume of fraudulent claims Janine had helped push through was already in the hundreds. By the end of 2021, when the federal pandemic programs began winding down and her conspirators' demand started to taper, the total improper benefit payments attributable to her dismissals would cross $2.86 million. She kept a notebook, not of names, not of dollar amounts, just of dates. A column of small, handwritten dates in a black composition book she kept in a drawer in her bedroom. She would later tell a federal agent she did not remember why she had started keeping the dates. She would later be unable to explain why she had kept the notebook at all. The federal pandemic programs ended in the fall of 2021. The flood of money slowed. The political pressure on the agency to clear backlog was replaced by political pressure to find out where the money had gone. In the spring of 2022, Michigan's Auditor General opened a comprehensive audit of UIA pandemic-era operations. The auditors had access to the agency's claim processing records, the fraud prevention trigger logs, the reviewer login histories, and the eventual benefit payment outcomes. They began doing what no one inside the agency had time to do during the pandemic itself. They started cross-referencing. The first thing they cross-referenced was the dismissed trigger pattern. Across the entire fraud review staff, the rate of trigger dismissals had spiked in 2020 and 2021. That was expected. What was not expected was the within-unit variance. Most reviewers, even at the height of the pandemic chaos, showed dismissal patterns that clustered around procedural norms. A small number of reviewers showed dismissal patterns that did not. Janine's profile was one of the outliers. Her dismissal rate on triggers connected to address mismatches and employer record inconsistencies was significantly higher than her unit average. Her closure rate on information requests was higher. Her referral rate to the Office of Inspector General was lower. Standing alone, the numbers were ambiguous. Some reviewers were just more permissive than others. Some had different exception handling habits. The auditors did not stop with the dismissal pattern. They cross-referenced the claims Janine had personally cleared against the eventual fraud-finding determinations the agency had made post-payment. The match rate was extraordinary. Claims Janine had cleared were appearing in subsequent fraud findings at a rate that no honest reviewer's caseload should have produced. In the fall of 2022, the Auditor General's office referred the pattern to the Michigan UIA's own Office of Inspector General. The internal review confirmed the auditor's findings and identified the cluster of cleared claims as a probable corruption signal rather than an incompetence signal. By the spring of 2023, the matter had been referred to federal authorities. The federal agencies that opened the joint investigation were three: the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, the Department of Labor Office of Inspector General, Great Lakes Region, the FBI's Detroit Field Office. The lead federal prosecutor assigned to the matter was Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew J. Yakind in the Eastern District of Michigan. Janine did not know any of this was happening. She had stopped processing the conspiracy's claims more than a year earlier when the pandemic programs wound down. She still went to work every day. She still ran her unit's standard caseload. She still walked Jordan to the school bus stop on cool mornings, still kept the wall calendar updated, still attended monthly meetings of her professional association. She was, by every external measure, an ordinary state employee in her late 30s. The federal investigation that would change that designation was already 18 months old. The federal investigation was built in layers. The first layer was administrative. Subpoenas to the UIA for Janine's login records, claim processing histories, trigger dismissal logs, and supervisor communications. Subpoenas to her bank for account records covering the conduct window. Subpoenas to her cellular carrier for call detail records and tower data. The second layer was financial. Forensic accountants from the Department of Labor Office of Inspector General reconstructed every cash deposit, every unexplained transfer, every transaction inconsistent with her documented income. They mapped $50,000 in payments directly to Janine across roughly an 18-month window. They identified the parking lot drop points by triangulating cell tower data against the timestamps of cash deposits. They identified the intermediary who had run the wire transfers and built a separate file on him. The third layer was the smoking gun. Federal investigators sat down with the UIA's fraud prevention architecture and pulled every claim Janine had personally cleared across the conduct window. They cross-referenced each cleared claim against the conspirators' broader scheme. The match was overwhelming. Claim after claim showed the same pattern. A trigger fires. The trigger is routed to Janine's queue. Janine logs in. Janine pulls the file. Janine dismisses the trigger and closes the information request, sometimes within minutes of opening the file, sometimes without any documented review activity at all. Days later, the benefit payment hits a prepaid card. Days after that, the conspirators move the money. The cross-reference produced a documentary chain that no defense could break. The dismissed triggers existed in the UIA's permanent records with Janine's login attached to each one. The information requests existed in the same records, marked closed by her, time-stamped to the second. The benefit payments existed in the disbursement records. The prepaid card destinations existed in the federal payment processor's records. The cash flowing back to Janine existed in her bank's records. The cell tower data placed her at the drop points. The intermediary, when confronted, agreed to cooperate. The intermediary's cooperation produced the text messages. There were not many. Janine had been careful about phones. But there were enough. a March 2020 exchange about the queue moving slow, a June 2020 exchange about the new batch is ready, 3 are flagged, a November 2020 exchange about I told you not to text this number. The text did not lay out the scheme in plain language. They did not have to. They placed Janine in the room with the conspirators at the times the conspirators were running claims through her queue. In the spring of 2025, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Michigan presented the case to a federal grand jury in Detroit. The grand jury returned an indictment charging Janine Rayford with conspiracy to commit federal program bribery and aggravated identity theft. We are heading into the federal courtroom now. The investigation is closed. The indictment is returned. The plea is on the table. If you want to know exactly how the system handled this one, subscribe and stay with me. We break down every detail of what happens when a public employee monetizes their access, and the answer is rarely the one people expect. Federal agents arrived at the Beach Daily Roadhouse on a Tuesday morning in late spring of 2025. The arrest team was small, 2 FBI special agents, 1 DOLOIG investigator. A surveillance vehicle had been parked 1 block over since 5 in the morning, monitoring the driveway. Janine was already awake. She had made coffee. Jordan, now 11, was eating cereal at the kitchen island. Andre had left for work 20 minutes earlier. When the doorbell rang, Janine assumed it was a delivery. The lead agent identified himself through the screen door, displayed his credentials, and stated the purpose of the visit. Janine looked at him for several seconds before unlocking it. "Mrs. Rayford, I need you to step outside the house, please. We have a federal warrant for your arrest." "Can I call my husband?" "You will have time for phone calls after we process you, ma'am. Step out, please." "My son needs to go to school." "We will wait while you make arrangements. Keep your hands where I can see them." She stepped back into the house. The agents waited on the porch. She called Andre, told him in a flat voice that federal agents were at the house with a warrant and that he needed to come home for Jordan. She kissed her son on the forehead. She told him he was going to be okay. She told him to listen to his father, to finish his cereal, to remember it was library day. In the back of the federal vehicle on the drive to the federal building in Detroit, the lead agent asked her a single question. He asked if she wanted to give a statement. "I want a lawyer," she said. She did not speak again for the remainder of the drive. The indictment named 2 charges. Count 1, conspiracy to commit federal program bribery under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 666, with a statutory maximum of 5 years in federal prison. Count 2, aggravated identity theft under Title 18, Section 1028A, which carries a mandatory 2-year sentence to run consecutively to any other sentence imposed. The mandatory minimum was the part that mattered. The aggravated identity theft count meant that whatever Janine and her defense team negotiated on the bribery charge, 2 additional years would stack on top. There was no probation. There was no concurrent sentencing. There was no judicial discretion to depart. Janine retained private counsel. Her attorney was a Detroit defense lawyer with 20 years of experience in federal white-collar cases. The early motions explored the standard angles: a challenge to the cell tower data, a challenge to the chain of custody on the intermediary's phone, a request for additional discovery on the agency's trigger dismissal patterns across the unit, to argue that her behavior was statistically indistinguishable from her peers during the pandemic surge. None of the motions moved the needle. The documentary record was too complete. In the summer of 2025, plea negotiations began in earnest. The U.S. Attorney's Office was willing to recommend a sentence below the bribery count's statutory maximum in exchange for a guilty plea, full acceptance of responsibility, and Janine's cooperation against the remaining conspirators. The aggravated identity theft count's mandatory 2 years was non-negotiable. It was federal law. On August 28, 2025, Janine Rayford appeared in federal court before U.S. District Judge Judith E. Levy. The hearing was brief by federal court standards. The plea colloquy walked through each count, each element, each consequence. Janine answered yes to every question. She entered guilty pleas to both counts on the indictment. U.S. Attorney Jerome F. Gorgon, Jr., for the Eastern District of Michigan, released a statement after the plea. If you are a public official whose side hustle is taking bribes, your next job will be answering to a judge. Corruption destroys public trust in government and will be aggressively prosecuted by my office. Michigan UIA Director Jason Palmer released a separate statement. This plea sends a powerful message that no one is above the law, not even those who work for the UIA. Our staff is required to adhere to strict ethics guidelines. Janine Rayford willingly violated that professional code of conduct, betraying her colleagues and the taxpayers of Michigan for her own short-sighted financial gain. Sentencing was scheduled for January 8, 2026. The ratio that animates this case is the one that captures the institutional damage: $50,000 in personal gain, $2.86 million in fraudulent benefits routed to third-party claimants, a roughly 57-to-1 ratio of public harm to private profit. The dismissed triggers Janine closed at her kitchen table during the pandemic are still being unwound by Michigan auditors. The broader Michigan UIA fraud landscape, totaling billions in pandemic-era overpayments, is still being quantified piece by piece. Janine Rayford was released on bond pending sentencing. She lives for now in the Beach Daily Roadhouse. The composition book with the column of handwritten dates is in federal custody, marked as Exhibit 37. Jordan still rides the school bus on Beach Daily. Andre still goes to work. The wall calendar in the kitchen still hangs where it has hung since 2014. The dates on it now include a federal sentencing date in black ink, circled twice, with a question mark beside it. This case was unsettling, but the next case on the right-hand side will rewrite what you thought public trust corruption could look like. Click it now.